again. Welcome to the first of our Psychological Secrets of Writing panel. We've got three brilliant authors with us this evening who also have a background in psychology and or therapy. I'm going to kick off with just getting each of them to introduce themselves, but because I am the host, I am going to go first. So I am Philippa East. I'm an author of psychological suspense novels published by HQ HarperCollins. My books are in order. My debut, which is Little White Lies. My second book, which is Safe and Sound. And I also have a third book, which is coming out in January. And I don't have the book, but I have a t-shirt, which you can all admire. Who doesn't want their book on a t-shirt? Yeah, so in my day job, I'm actually a clinical psychologist, and I worked in the NHS for a number of years, specialising in a few different things, including eating disorders, complex trauma, and psychosis. I now work part-time in private practice, and I still do that alongside my writing, primarily doing individual therapy with adult clients. Okay, so I am going to now switch to Bev Thomas. If you can unmute, Bev, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, yeah, so I'm Bev Thomas, and I'm really delighted to be here tonight. Thank you so much, Philippa, for organising. Fantastic. So I've written two books, both published by Faber. The first was A Good Enough Mother, which is about a psychotherapist who works in a kind of psychoanalytic way, and she sees a patient who reminds her of her missing son, and things sort of unravel from there. And then this one has just come out 4 weeks ago. It's called The Family Retreat, and it's set over a rather intense 3 weeks on a holiday in Dorset. All does not go well, as you probably imagine. So I also trained as a clinical psychologist many years ago, and worked for a long time in the NHS in primary care in Tower Hamlets. And in fact, my main protagonist in this book is a GP in Tower Hamlets. So I sort of drew very much on that that kind of work experience. So I worked for a number of years in as a clinical psychologist, and I moved into working into sort of teams and work with organisations. So I still do that now. So I kind of divide my time similar to Philippa. So I work probably about half of the week working still mainly in the NHS and local authority, but working with generally with mental health teams. So doing the kind of support, reflective practice and consultancy with teams. So it's kind of, I don't do any direct clinical work anymore. So that's me. You're on mute, Philippa, is it?
I'll get this right eventually. I was going to say we can probably try unmuting ourselves, just the four of us. But if we get another echoey, we can shut ourselves off again. Okay. Kate, would you like to go next in introducing yourself to our lovely audience?
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks ever so much for coming. And thank you to Philippa for inviting me and organising all of this. So I've been a writer pretty much all my life, and what happened to me at the beginning of the 2000s was that I had quite a bad bout of depression, and I realised that writing could help me get better. Basically, was a way of healing, and I used it for myself, and I began to become interested in perhaps helping other people or supporting other people in the same way. And that's when I trained to be a psychotherapeutic counsellor. And for a while I had a private practice, and I saw people one-to-one, and I also ran a creative writing group for people with anxiety and depression. But these days, I tend to run one-off workshops, and they tend to be more for professionals and carers. But I'm very interested in that link between creative writing and well-being. So that's really why I trained to be a counsellor. I never really had the idea that I would be a counsellor, but I felt that in order to do that kind of work, I needed that kind of training. And I found out a hell of a lot about myself in the training.
Don't we all?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was very lucky in what would it have been? Beginning of 2020, I got a contract to write a crime series for Constable Little Brown. And 2 books have come out. So A Wake of Crows. Is that backwards?
No, it's fine for us.
That's good.
Fine, okay. And Drowning, Not Waving, which has just come out. And it's a crime series. So the main protagonist is a woman in her 50s who comes to Scarborough, where I live, as a probationary detective constable. And her narrative obviously moves through the 3 books, but there's a crime in each one. And the first one makes a lot of connection with East Germany and the history of East Germany. So that's me.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kate. And now let's come to Julia. So yeah, Julia, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your work and your writing?
Hi, everyone. I'm a psychologist and a psychotherapist. I studied psychology back in the late 70s and started work as a business psychologist 36 years ago in 1986. And I've worked as a business psychologist in 2 consultancies and then as an independent for many years. I was in an American consultancy, in a small niche business psychology consultancy. And then I trained as a psychotherapist 22 years ago. So I've been knocking around for a while. And then my books are Psychological Suspense. So this one came out about a year ago. And it is, the protagonist is a psychotherapist, and she's led astray by a manipulative client and breaks all boundaries. So that was fun to write. And I have to say, I am nothing like the therapist in this book. I have to make that really clear. The second book, The Accident, I don't have a cover of, but they're too small to see, but I am wearing earrings of my book covers. The courtesy of what's that? Etsy, yes. And that comes out, The Accident comes out next month, and it's about a woman who becomes completely obsessed by a girl who falls off a bridge as she's passing under it onto her car, and she becomes obsessed with working out who this woman is because she's a Jane Doe and no one knows. So again, it's another sort of psychological suspense novel. I think that's all. Thank you.
Fantastic. And I'm going to take this little opportunity to tell all of our audience not only that they can ask questions of our panelists as we go, and I'll read them out, but also I'm putting in the chat a link to where you can find the books of all the author, psychologist, therapists taking part in these panels, in case you like the sound of what they're writing and want to check them out further. Okay, so one of the things I was just registering in my little brain as we were all talking is that we actually all write in the sort of psychological thriller, psychological suspense / crime genre. And I was wondering whether, as well as there being a number of sort of links between writing and therapy, which of course we'll get into, do you think that there's a particular draw to that genre coming from a psychology background? Or to put that question another way, do you think that having that kind of psychology background particularly lends itself to the kind of storylines and characters and issues that we are often exploring in the kind of psychological thriller and crime genre? I'm going to throw that to Kate to start.
Interesting question. I think that I was drawn to the genre because it's quite a wide genre these days, and so it gives quite a lot of possibilities when you're writing. And also I think that it's one of the genres that is asking questions about society, and that's really what I'm interested in doing. I think that I've just been to a festival, actually. I've been to a crime writing festival, and somebody said to me, "Oh, why do you think all crime writers are such nice people?" For a start off, they're not all such nice people, but I did say, well, maybe it's because we put all our dark thoughts into our writing, so we can be nice. So yeah, I think there's definitely an interest in, and I want my crime, the people who commit my crimes, to have a reason for doing it. I'm very much into motivation, and I certainly think that has come from both the therapy that I had myself and also the training that I had, to look for people's motivations, because even if it makes no sense to the onlooker, it's got to make sense to the person who's doing whatever they're doing. There's got to be a rationale behind it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually, isn't it? That a lot of the time in reading crime and thriller, as well as kind of the whodunit element, a lot of contemporary crime and thriller is about why, isn't it? It's like you're saying, it's like psychological thriller genre. It's a character study as much as anything, rather than just some random criminal doing hijinks, Yeah. What about you?
There's got to be some.
Yeah, go on, Bev. Yeah,
I was just thinking, I mean, one of the things that I probably liked most of all about working in a clinical setting and being a therapist was that kind of uncovering and unraveling, so somebody comes, and it is about a narrative, isn't it? Someone's coming in there trying to make sense of perhaps something really terrible that's happened in that moment. But obviously, to understand that, it means, going back and trying to make sense of that, linking back from the past and present. So I think all of it is, for me, that was the most interesting thing about therapy, was the sort of, Freud talked about the archaeology, didn't he? Sort of, it was the sort of digging and unearthing and trying to kind of understand. And I think that, for me, is very similar in that process of the narrative of fiction, is that you do want to, I'm sure it's the same for everyone, but the journey of writing is quite a long one. So you have to be sort of, well, for me, I have to be interested enough, don't you, to sort of answer the questions that you're answering. Otherwise, I get bored, so in some ways, I think there's a sort of question to be posed for me. Or I think that each of my books, I'm trying to answer something for myself, and using the characters to sort of unravel that or answer that for me. So I think there are real parallels around the process of uncovering stroke discovery that takes place in the kind of narrative of fiction, which is so similar in my mind to the narrative of therapy.
And just picking up on Bev's point about relations to therapy, I was just thinking that actually our characters make decisions that obviously have knock-on effects. And in therapy, my model of therapy, because there are so many different models, there's a belief that people make the best decision that they can that makes sense to them at that time in the circumstance they're in. So there's no such thing as looking back on the past and saying, oh, I made the wrong decision. Given the information you had then, you made a logical and rational choice, usually. And it's the same with our characters. They're making these choices that actually, as a third party standing outside it with broader information, you can see they are the wrong choices. It's clearly really wrong for this therapist to do the things she's doing. And some of the reviews have said, I just wanted to shake her and say, stop. But given the information you have and where you are in your life, it's a rational decision at that time in your head. Doesn't mean it is when you have further information. And I think that's really interesting to explore.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, and someone's we kind of touched on this just a second ago, Bev, but Sarah Clark has asked.
Yes, I was going to say the question about childhood. That's really interesting.
Yeah, she says, as you are looking for the psychological aspect of the why, do you consider the childhoods of your characters? And I'm going to add a second part to that question, which is just to remind everyone to turn their videos off. Okay, go ahead. Do you want to carry on with that one a little bit, Julia, and then we'll come back round again to Bev and Kate?
Sorry, I got distracted. Can you remind me what the question was?
I can. It was from Sarah Clark, and she says, as you're looking for the psychological aspect of the why, do you consider the childhoods of your characters?
Yes, yeah, and one of my bugbears about some courses in how to develop your characters is that it focuses not, you know, some of the courses, some of the exercises focus a lot on the here and now, like what have they got in their handbag. Now that's a fun exercise to do, and I'm you know, I think it's brilliant, along with other things. One of the things that's most important is knowing your character's personality and how it developed, where it came from, what led to them being the way they are, what traumas did they go through, or what caring positive experiences. And I think those are really, really important to kind of get to grips with in service of the plot.
Yeah, I was just going to add in, because I absolutely agree about the childhood. And I wonder if that's something that seems blatantly obvious to us as psychologists, but we maybe forget that wouldn't be kind of an automatic, you know, obvious element of someone's self to consider. Bev, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is really interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think probably it would be considered, but one of the things that I'm really aware of, and I'm sure all of you will perhaps relate to that, and maybe I'm sure people listening as well, watching, is that very often, you know, something has happened way back, you know, a couple of generations back, that has, of course, ramifications that roll out, you know, an adopted child, this, or a breakup, or someone leaving the family. And the ramifications of that is that kind of transgenerational trauma that I think is really interesting. And I think both of my books cover that, not very kind of, it's not sort of foregrounded, but I think I like the idea of the sort of iceberg analogy, that, you know, what you might see on the surface, it's on the page, you know, there's a whole lot that's going on underneath, which informs why a character might be the sort of mother that they are, or because then when you meet their own mother and you get an insight into what's going on, and maybe, you know, it adds a kind of layer. I think the layering for me is really, I found it fascinating and I continue to find it fascinating in my work. So I think it's fascinating to try and pull it off in a book, on the page in some ways, to use that kind of backstory to really inform. And I really agree, Julia. I think that's really interesting, isn't it? How so many of those exercises focus on the now, which are interesting. But I mean, I'm not sure anybody looking at my handbag would say much. It's just a mess. I mean, maybe that's it. I'm a mess. I mean, it's kind of, I mean, it's not really that, you know, I totally agree. I think it's kind of really interesting, isn't it? I mean, one of the exercises I often do with teams is getting them to think about their own family of origin and how that might influence how they are in their team, you know, and I think people sort of are blown away by that exercise. It's so simple, but of course the translation of you and your family and what role you might have taken up as a sibling or whatever in relation to you at work is, of course, it can fill in it, but of course it tells you so much about, you know, are you the one that's the kind of fixer and the sort of out and the smoother over, or are you the one who likes to chuck the grenades in? And, you know, I mean, I'm simplifying it, but I think it's really interesting, isn't it? So those things I think about motivation, as you say, Julia, really inform, so that you don't read and think, but they wouldn't do that. You kind of want to believe, don't you, that they make psychological sense. Well, I think we're kind of agreeing.
And the objects in the handbag one is an interesting one from the point of view that, okay, let's imagine there's a gun in there. Well, the point is, how would your character react to that gun? What kind of gun would it? Would it be their kid's water pistol, etc., etc.? And those are the things that are interesting. It's the the whys behind the what.
Yeah. What about you, Kate?
Yeah, I'm not sure I've got much to add to that, but I mean, certainly the therapy that I went through myself and also the training that I had talked a lot about how what happened then and there affects what happens in the here and now, and I think that definitely comes into both of my all three of my novels. My third novel is not going to be published until next year, and it's also affecting my main protagonist, Donna Morris, who is, as I said, a woman in her 50s, and she has quite an interesting childhood, which is affecting her now, much to her surprise, really. I don't think she kind of didn't expect it to have the ramifications that it did have. So I mean, I think that is true for all of us, that our past affects our present, and what we do with that knowledge will affect our future. So why wouldn't you put that into your characters? I mean, it just makes total sense to me, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those of you who have done any sort of training or awareness of cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT has a really nice what is called longitudinal formulation, which basically means including the kind of whole history as well. It's kind of not just a here and now snapshot, it's looking back into the past. And it basically, at the top, it has early experiences, and then it shows how those early experiences influence the fundamental beliefs that we hold about ourselves. From those beliefs, it shows how we develop what's called rules for living, which is, things like, never trust anyone, for example. And of course, that then will translate into day-to-day thoughts and behaviors and reactions and feelings. And it's such an elegant not saying that CBT is the be all and end all, but that model in terms of character development is great. And actually, on our next panel, we have clinical psychologist Stephanie Carty, who actually runs workshops on using our knowledge of developmental psychology to help people create characters. So again, tune in next month to hear more about that. Interestingly, as we're talking quite a bit about how our psychology knowledge really helps us, particularly with kind of character development, I've got a double part question here. One is my part, and one is from Steph Edgar in the chat. So the first part is, do you also use your knowledge of therapy or psychology to help you with your plots as well as your character development? And if so, how? And also, Steph Edgar looks at the flip side and says, oh no, sorry, hang on a sec. No, it's not Steph's one, it's Casey Chamberlain's one. I'll come to Steph's in a minute. My chat moved up. Casey Chamberlain says, given your levels of expertise and training, do you have to be cautious about how much sciencey stuff you include in the writing, which I guess is a little bit like historical fiction writers knowing a lot and maybe putting too much in? So how does psychology, or does psychology or your knowledge of therapy processes also help you with your plot development? And is there a danger that sometimes we know too much and can overwhelm the reader with all of our knowledge? Bev, let's start with you.
So the plot one's really interesting, isn't it? Because I think I come to, I mean, as I touched on before, I come to each book with a kind of theme or question that I want to answer in some ways. So I guess sometimes that means working backwards. And I think that often, again, I think that's a very similar way of working with clients. They might be coming with a thing that's happened, and you have to work backwards, don't you? Because, you know, I think you were talking about the fundamental beliefs, isn't it? And I'm just thinking of somebody who, for example, may have chronic anxiety about a thing that's happened. You know, maybe a fundamental belief from so much earlier might be the world isn't a safe place for some reason, you know, and that's part of the uncovering and how those two events might be linked. So I think, I mean, I think plot's really interesting. I often try to think, I often tend to think of the kind of what if question. So in A Good Enough Mother, I was really interested in what would it be like to be a therapist who has your adult son missing because there's been a kind of family estrangement, and then you have a patient come in who looks very similar to him. What would that be like? How would you manage that for someone who's grieving? So it was a kind of exploration of grief, but it was also about that kind of fundamental what if question, which in some ways I think is at the core of a lot of therapy, isn't it? It's kind of, why am I here? What if this happened? And this thing has happened. And sometimes people present because it is the worst fear that's maybe happened, and it's kind of how to kind of work at unraveling that with them collaboratively, I think. So I do love plots. I mean, in the family retreat, it's a sort of, generally it's an exploration of kind of male anger and male rage, and there's a lot of men in it who don't behave very well, but at the same time, plot wise, you know, it's hard to work out until the sort of bomb goes off where it's going to go off. So I suppose I was very interested in seeing families under pressure and looking at what can happen when families are under pressure. But, you know, plot wise, there is a thing that kind of drives you to want to know where that bomb is going off, but it could have been in a few places. But I mean, other people may have other thoughts about the plot and the psychology.
What about you, Kate? What would you say from working in the sort of therapy sphere and your own therapy?
Yeah. Gosh, I'm not really. I was never really a plotter. I was one of those people who just kind of set my characters off and just kind of didn't really know where the story was going. But more recently, I've discovered that it's actually more efficient to have a bit of a plot before you start. so I'm kind of rewinding myself on that. I mean, I think I do really try and have the plots coming from my characters. So knowing my characters inside out hopefully gives me the plot. And it's quite interesting what you said, Bev, about intergenerational trauma, which I'm also theoretically interested in. But looking at Donna Morris's backstory, there's so much intergenerational trauma, and or potentially there is anyway, and of course her backstory isn't the main story of the book. The main story of the book is the crime that she's investigating. So it's a bit of a balancing act, really, to kind of manage to get both the development of Donna's story and narrative alongside the sort of crime narrative. I don't know if that answers either question, but anyway, that's where I was. I don't know about you, Julia. What do you think?
Yeah, well, if any of you know Myers-Briggs, the type indicator, I'm a J on that, which is they're the people who make kind of quick decisions, like plans, etc. And I'm a real plotter and always have been. I came to novel writing via script writing, after I'd done a couple of courses in that. And so I'd come across Save the Cat from a script writing perspective. And if those of you who are interested in plotting, it's Save the Cat Writes a Novel is quite an interesting book. It gives you a framework. And actually, I've developed quite a few plotting tools for myself to use from that. If anyone's interested in having a copy of them, just drop me an email through my website or DM me, and I can send you something. But in terms of actually fleshing that out, in the real world, we have problems as writers, as human beings, broadly in I'm being terribly simplistic here, but broadly in 3 buckets. So one bucket is the environment we're in, and so those problems are things around space, time, our homes, our families, etc. So the environment in which we're operating in. Then you have a whole bucket around capability and behavior, whether you know how to do something, whether you're capable of it, the behaviors you use, the habits you have. And then there's a bucket around identity and belief, which is one of the things you've touched on already, those rules for living and so on, how you see yourself. And so, and I use that model a lot in coaching, a lot in therapy, but it's also useful for me thinking about the way I'm dealing with my problems in life. And I saw someone who put something about submitting, I think, in the chat, and dealing with those kinds of things. I've got problems in each of those buckets, and I make sure my character's problems are illustrated in each of those buckets. So my character in this book, the psychotherapist, she still lives in her hometown where she grew up. Her environment is constrained. She's still friends with all the people she went to school with, but she secretly wants to break out, but she just hasn't got the capability. She doesn't know how. And her belief is she's not very good. She's an imposter. So she keeps going on courses to learn more about different types of therapy. And when this man sweeps in and sweeps her off her feet and offers her all these things she hasn't got, it looks like the solution. So I use this to try and shape my plot to make sure I'm digging into each level. Again, if you want more information on any of this, just drop me a DM or an email and I'm happy to share.
Yeah, brilliant. And the second part, just to chip in on, do we ever know too much and do we ever put too much? Because we mentioned the Myers-Briggs, we mentioned these different models, we all have these different formulation understandings. Do you think we ever do we get lost in the weeds ever with our knowledge, do you think? Or do you think we manage to keep it organic on the page?
I don't think I'm well trained enough to get lost in. A lot of my experience came from my own experience of depression and therapy. I mean, I obviously had three years training, but I was and I always will be a writer first, I think. So that's where I hit, I think. Yeah.
I really wanted to explore the sort of psychoanalytic theory in A Good Enough Mother, and it was quite a challenge, because I think it is quite a challenge to sort of explore it. I mean, obviously they are in the kind of therapy setting, but I used the transference as a big kind of plot in the book, and I, partly because I really love that particular theoretical model, and I kind of really wanted to sort of play with it in a novel. And really, interestingly enough, when I submitted it, all of that stuff was fine, and then my editor came back and said, it's all fine apart from chapter 11. And I was going, what's wrong with chapter 11? And she said that chapter 11 was when the writers stopped being Ruth Hartland but turned into Bev Thomas, and hilariously it was the chapter where she was doing a piece of group work with a staff team, which is sort of what I do a lot of now, and it felt like it was, so it just feels like Bev Thomas is on her soapbox talking about the NHS and the cuts. It's like, okay, so I had to kind of reel back. So I mean, I think it is interesting, isn't it, to I mean, I guess that's the same with anything, like you mentioned earlier on, Philip, about historical novels. I mean, I'm really marvel at how people do that and drop stuff in, but it doesn't feel like you're being kind of told, here you are in 17th century Greece because I'm noticing all these things. And I think it's such a skill to do that. So I think it's probably the same with a lot of writing. Whatever you're doing, you have to kind of maybe you go a bit too far first and then you reel back. I always think that put more in, take out. Writing is rewriting, as far as I'm sure as we're all concerned. You just keep on editing or rewriting. But I think less is more, isn't it? But sometimes you've just got to overdo to take out to get what you that's how I see it.
Yeah. Okay, so there's such interesting questions here. I'm going to go off my own, sort of screw up my own, screw up, not as in screw up, although I've done some of that tonight as well. My own questions, because we've got such great questions in the from the audience. So there's another, I'm going to come back to yours, Steph. I haven't forgotten about you, don't worry. But there's a really interesting couple of questions here which kind of overlap, I think. And it's also linked to a question that I particularly wanted to put to you, Bev, because in your first novel, Bev, you've got a psychotherapist as your main character, like you mentioned, so that's in a Good Enough Mother. And obviously you took a very brave decision, I think, to portray a member of our profession as your main character, being in that profession yourself. And Sarah Clarke, again, I suppose it's this question about how closely might our professional identities as therapists or psychologists and the fictional characters that we're creating and selling in our books, how much might they overlap, and kind of what are the pros and what are the dangers of that? So Sarah Clarke asks a question which is sort of related, which is, do you ever find that you include aspects of your real world clients in your fictional characters? And Natalie Riley Johnson says, something I worry about as a clinical psychologist hoping to publish a novel is that patients or clients reading the novels, my worry is patients, clients reading the novels and that impacting in some way on our therapeutic relationship or their sense of me as a professional. For example, a novel about a psychologist making dubious moral decisions, or even just the presence of any violent or sexual content in the writing. Have you experienced this, and how would you deal with it? So I think it's a really interesting question, isn't it, about how much might we portray of what we learn as therapists in our books? And what about the idea of potentially our clients or patients reading one of our novels, and how might that affect their relationship to us? So yeah, any thoughts about that, Bev?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I'd written quite a lot before I got A Good Enough Mother published, and I'd written probably about everything but my work. So it's kind of interesting that this is the one that then was kind of got me an agent and then was taken up by Faber. So and I have to say I wasn't working clinically when I wrote it, so I wasn't seeing patients and I had stopped doing that kind of 20 odd years ago, moved into organizational work. But I mean, I guess my rule of thumb is we're constantly drawing on, and obviously for this book, I drew on what the experience was like sitting in a room in that kind of fairly claustrophobic way sometimes, particularly if you're if a person you're seeing is resonating with you in some ways to do with your own life. So I was kind of wanting to really mine that kind of territory. But in terms of, and there's quite a few different clients, patients covered in this, but not a single one of those people touch on any experience that I've had with a patient. I was very clear. I mean, a couple of things leapt to mind. I thought, well, I can't use that. So what I was more interested in was the sort of emotional experience. And I listened to somebody talk the other day about, you can write about, say, grief, but you might not be writing about the grief of your character, but you can mine your own experience of grief and put that, and I thought that was kind of blindingly obvious, but kind of really interesting, so I mined a lot of my own experiences, and I mean, there's a lot about motherhood in both of my books, and so I've certainly, mined quite a lot of that my poor children. But so you're kind of mining stuff that's you, but you're turning it in then to a very different story, and that's how I see it. And I do quite a lot of one-to-one coaching, and occasionally, you know, people might say, oh, I see you've had a book, but it kind of happens quite rarely. I mean, I guess unless you're sort of, well, it happens quite rarely to me, unless you're Richard Osmond or somebody who sold 120,000 copies on his first day. So it sort of feels, I have to say I was much more terrified than it turned out to be an issue. So at the time I still work part-time at Tavistock Consulting, which is connected to the clinic. And of course she works in a sort of trauma clinic, which works psychoanalytically. And I was thinking, oh, this is going to be terrible. This is going to be terrible. I'm never going to be able to, you know, and of course I sent it to all the people that said, oh, it's great. We love it. You know, so all your sort of, I guess it's a bit like showing it to your family, isn't it? And they think, oh, and you think, oh, they're going to see themselves in it. And then they kind of go, oh, it's great. And they didn't at all. So my feeling is that we can probably worry, providing you're not using, well, my feeling is it'd be interesting to see what the others think. It's providing you're not using anything that has happened to you or anybody that's relatable to you, but you're kind of mining the emotional experiences. I think you're on safe territory. I can't really answer the question about if you're still working clinically. I'm sure others could do that better than me because I'm not. But you know, it is fiction. It's fiction. I think it's very different if you're writing a non-fiction case study, which I know from people who have done that. It goes through a lot of rigorous, what's the word? You know, kind of assessing and rereading to ensure that legally you're not in any kind of hot water. But every fictional book says at the beginning, doesn't it? You know, no person
was harmed in the making of.
Yeah, exactly. Was harmed.
I definitely have to echo you, Bev. So as someone who is still in active clinical practice and actively seeing clients, first of all, but like you say, Bev, make a very concerted effort never to directly use a client's story. And in fact, I've had clients come with narratives that I thought would make brilliant books, but I deliberately would have to say that that's completely off limits.
Yeah.
And yeah, again, I've probably, of all the clients that I've seen, I've probably had, I could easily count on one hand the number who've actually even realized that I'm a writer, and probably one or two who've actually read my books, and they've mainly just said, oh, that was nice, and then it's moved on. So I think, again, it's something that I grappled with and worried about, you know, would it affect my role, would it affect the relationship? But actually, I think because I never bring it up, it's not something I ever mention, I don't advertise it. I think that, yeah, I think so far clients have been fine with it. What about you, Julia?
It kind of feels quite separate.
Yeah. Do you feel similarly, Julia, about?
Yeah, and I agree. And to be honest, you know, I suspect all of us have contributed to psychological texts as well. And some of the psychological textbooks I've written for have asked for case studies, and always I've just made them up. And I was hoist by my own petard on one of them, because the editor of the whole book came to me and said, could I get written permission from all the families I'd written about in my case studies? And I had to say I'd made them up from generic cases that I dealt with over the years, because I'm not going to tell someone else's story. It's not mine to tell. So, you know, I perfectly agree with what you've said, Bev and Philippa, you know, that actually you don't go mining your clients' stories. It just feels wrong.
What about you, Kate?
Well, I think I'm in a bit of a different situation in that it's many years since I've been in private practice, and I always saw myself as a writer first and a counsellor second, really. The counsellor kind of was a bit of an accident for a few years. I think all writers, maybe all people, I don't know, but as a writer, I feel that I'm absorbing characters and plot lines and emotions and everything all the time. I'm a bit of a sponge. I think I saw Sarah Paretsky. No, I'm not sure who it was. I saw another writer being interviewed, and she said that writers are vampires. I think I prefer to be a sponge than a vampire, but there is a certain I can't see what that is.
What does that say?
Careful or you'll end up in my novel.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. But I do think that I think if you are in being serious, I think if you are in clinical practice, you do have to be careful, obviously. But I do think to a certain extent that whatever you're absorbing as a writer, you absorb it and then you assimilate it and then you put it out there. It's going to be changed because it's come through you. You know, you're not that person. So whatever you're absorbing and putting out there to a certain extent will be changed. But I don't think I have the sort of professional dilemmas that's being asked about. In my next novel, which is coming out next year, which is called No Justice, there is a point of view character who is a counsellor like I was, and we do see her in session, and what we're mainly experiencing is her anxiety about being a counsellor, which is completely from me, because I spent most of my time really anxious about whether I was doing a good job or not. So that's mainly what I've put in my writing, really. But yeah, I think you have to be careful. Obviously, you have to be careful. You have to be careful about anybody's story. But I do think that you can assimilate, you can make what was the word you used called, Julia, where you put a lot of different family traits together and you make a kind of conglomerate character out of it. So I think there's ways around it.
Brilliant. Julia, I have a question for you now, and it ties in with the question from the lovely Steph Edgar, which we are going to come back to now. So Julia, you mentioned in your bio that you run a coaching and therapy business, as well as your writing and other bits and pieces, specifically to support creative people. And I was curious about whether there are kind of regular kind of advice or techniques or things that you tend to suggest to your clients in that area of work, in terms of, what stops people from being creative, what holds them back. And Steph's question is, similarly, as authors with a background in psychology, do you handle the trauma of being on submission better than the rest of us? So Julia, could you advise us as you would advise your clients?
I think it's not just the trauma of submission, it's the trauma of the whole damn journey. Nothing in the world prepared me for this.
Counsel us like you'd counsel your clients.
In serious answer to the question, the issue is that everybody's reasons are different, as we know, so there's no one size fits all. What stops one person from feeling confident about their writing is completely different to someone else. Writer's block can be caused by all sorts of different things. In fact, way back when I started my psychotherapy training, we had to do a modeling. We had to do a modeling project, not modeling as in walking down a catwalk, but modeling as in modeling someone who was really good at doing something, so that we could learn how to do it in a similar way or take the best of their recipe. And I went and interviewed writers. This was way before I'd done any sensible grown-up writing. I modelled writers on writer's block to find out how they handled it and what they did as my project. And that was fascinating because, of course, everybody had different reasons and different solutions. So I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all answer. Although something that really does appeal to me, I went to a Zoom course run by Zelda Lockhart, and one of the things she recommended was something I believe she calls them jump-offs. And she says, have a book beside you and just open it a random page and run your finger down the page without looking and read out the line that says, I sing a few lines, and it was the one I just put my finger on, and then take that as a jumping off point for one of your characters and what they would do and how they would do it, and then just see where it takes you. And I found that a really fascinating exercise, and it helped me come up with a completely different approach to a scene in the next book that's due to be published. So that's just one example of a tip, but I suspect we could all chuck a whole load of tips in the bags and come out with some really good stuff between the bunch of us tonight.
What about being on submission? Do you have any particular advice for not being blocked, but once you've...
Well, I'm probably the wrong person to ask, because with my very first book I wrote, which hasn't been published yet, I was on submission for a short period, and I got 3 full requests, and then I can't remember what happened. I think I pulled it, and then I entered, meanwhile I'd written something else, and I entered that into Blue Pencil's novel award, and I won, and I got signed by Madeline Milburn, having won that competition. So I'm a huge fan of competitions for people, because it does your ego good if you get long listed, short listed, whatever.
Also, there's a deadline, so they're so good, aren't they? Because they make you get it in on time.
Yeah, I think it's really good. And that book, as it happens, that I was signed for, is the second book. It's the next book to be published. They told me to go away and write another one. So I wrote the one that has been published and then reversed back into the first one. So so I'm the wrong person to ask about submission, because I'm just gearing myself up for it, the next one, which is a completely different genre. And so I need a different agent to support that genre.
Well, I will, sorry.
Well, no, go on.
I was just going to jump in and say I did a specific podcast episode with the In Suspense authors on exactly this, and I'm just putting the link in the chat for you all now. So going back to you, Steph, you might want to check out that In Suspense podcast episode. Okay, Kate, I have a question for you now.
Oh, okay.
Which is that you obviously mentioned that you got into training as a psychotherapeutic counsellor after, suffering with depression yourself.
Yeah.
And you kind of continue thinking about those links between creative writing and, recovery, I guess. And I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about, how you see the role of creativity and specifically creative writing to help people heal, whether that's, emotionally, psychologically, or maybe even physically as well.
Okay. I think that we're all creative creatures, and I think that creativity often gets squashed out of us in lots of different ways. Life happens, jobs happen, all sorts of things, and we stop nurturing our creativity. And I think just for general well-being, it's a good thing to find what makes you happy in terms of being creative. And it might be writing, or it might be art, or it might be making music, it might be singing. I don't know what it is, but there'll be something that will touch your creative soul, and I think it's just useful to find that and nourish it and give it time. I think that's one of the things, isn't it, that we often, when we think about all the things that we have to do in our lives, being creative or just sort of nourishing that small part of us often comes way down the priority list. So a bit like going out walking, getting exercise, eating well, be creative, that sort of for me is a recipe for well-being. But specifically, creative writing has several aspects to it, I suppose. Philippa, yourself, because you wrote was it your PhD or what was it, that your thesis?
My clinical doctoral thesis.
Yeah, that's it. So we had a bit of a discussion about this, that expressive writing has been shown to improve people's mental and physical well-being. And there's a certain cathartic aspect to it. But there's all sorts of areas in creative writing which can be useful. So there's making a narrative, which is also happens in therapy when we've been through quite a chaotic or a traumatic time. We often lose a sense of narrative, and it helps us to put a narrative onto what's happened to us, so that we have some kind of making sense, I suppose, by putting a narrative onto it. And putting some kind of form round of something that is chaotic or difficult. There's exercises where you might take on another persona, take on another aspect. So we might write from our own point of view, but then try and write from somebody else's point of view that was in the same situation or in the same experience. When we write using I, that's quite a close place to be. So sometimes with traumatic writing, we might want to write using we or you, which might give us more distance to what we're writing. So there's lots of ways that creative writing can help us to process what's happened to us, and maybe work towards having a different perspective on what's happened to us, and giving us some kind of perspective, I suppose. But for me, it's also about finding the joy in doing something creative. I think that's really important too.
Yeah, it's really interesting what you were saying about the perspective taking. I was just putting the link to my doctoral thesis research in the chat, which sounds a lot fancier than maybe it is. But James Penabaker, his main kind of research field was the impact of expressive writing on health generally across the board, and he particularly looked at the way that people would explore different perspectives as they wrote about a difficult or traumatic event. And that was something that he highlighted as being particularly healing. And I was thinking about the fact, what you were saying, Kate, about perhaps being able to see an event through the eyes of a bystander or an observer or a third party or just someone else. And I was wondering about maybe that's sometimes what we get from reading books as well, that we're able to experience an event or a situation that we might relate to, but see someone else go through it and be able to, as a result of that, understand our own experiences in a new way, perhaps a more compassionate way or whatever. And I think storytelling is so helpful, isn't it, in helping us learn how to navigate the world.
I definitely think that, and compassion is a good word. Compassion for ourselves, which I think a lot of us have too little compassion for ourselves, but also compassion for other people. Reading books, I think there's been some research done about how it can increase empathy for people who are very different from ourselves, because we're reading their story. But actually, if a story is written well enough or told well enough, we're actually going to walk in their shoes for those pages, and that can increase our empathy for other people who perhaps have very different experiences from us.
Yeah. Okay.
I just want to say, can I just say something very quickly about just echoing what you were saying, Kate, about creativity, because I totally agree with what you're saying about that, the time and how it gets kind of squished out of people. I think it's and I think there's two books that I found, just to share, that I found really helpful on that. One is, probably people have come across it, but the Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. I think, she really does go into some of that kind of stuff, I think, in a really helpful way. And Natalie Goldberg, Writing Down the Bones, I also think is amazing. And I was very lucky to do a workshop with her. And what was so powerful about it was that she basically would just say, she'd give you a title, a little bit like you were doing, Julie, with the kind of thing on the, so she'd say, the last time I went on holiday, or drinking a glass of water. I mean, kind of any random thing. And then she'd sort of get everybody to write for 10 minutes. And then she had this thing, which was no good, no bad, just writing. So she'd listen. So people would read it out, and then she'd go, thank you. And then someone else. So it took away all the you know, have I written something rubbish? Is it any good? You know, it was really interesting over the course of the week that people read out really moving, but, you know, you weren't allowed to comment. And I thought it was such a really interesting lesson on taking yourself out of judgment and, like you say, being kind of very compassionate, but it was also not kind of forcing us out of that thing of like, am I good? Have I done a good piece? You know, oh no, you didn't like that. It was a bad piece. And it was very grounding. So I do think sometimes just writing without expectation or needing something back is very gratifying and grounding. So if, you know, those are two things that I found really helpful anyway.
And I'll just come back. Those two books are excellent, but also there's an organisation called Lapidus, Lapidus. And if you're interested in exploring this more, then you know, you'll find people of the same ilk there.
Yeah.
I'm putting all of these links in the chat. So given that you are here live, audience members, you haven't just waited to watch the YouTube, you get the advantage of being able to read the chat. So you can get all these brilliant links, so you can open them and quickly save them on your computer or your iPad or whatever. Fantastic. So I'm going to come to Kingsley Pearson's question, which I think is a great question to pick our brains on for all the other aspiring writers out there. I'm assuming this is kind of the motivation behind this question, Kingsley. Kingsley asks, which elements of mental health and or therapy do you find agents, editors, readers, etc. are most interested in? So we're going to hook them in with something therapy psychological. What do you think is the kind of hot thing at the moment? Can we give any insights into that?
Oh, I think that's tricky. I had lunch recently with my agent, and we were talking about because there is a bit of because it's been such a sort of rubbish couple of years and still continues to be rubbish in so many ways. There's a kind of sometimes there's a flavour, isn't there, towards something like everybody needs to write uplit, so we all feel really good about ourselves. You know, either you can write uplit or you can't, and I'm just too dark to write uplit. But her response was, you know, you should just always write what you're interested in, because if you're really, really interested and passionate in it, somebody else will be too. And I think that's really interesting, isn't it? That sometimes we're trying to sort of second guess always, what will someone like, or what will someone want to read about? So that's what just sort of stayed with me from that conversation. But others may think so, you might think differently.
I don't know the answer to the question, but I will say that being somebody who has issues with my own mental health and have done in the past, I really want to, my mission is to say, actually, just because you've got mental health problems doesn't mean that you go around committing crime. And I think that you can actually be quite you can be an okay member of society and still have depression or anxiety, you know, and you can be useful to other people. So that's my bit of a mission, and I don't really care whether readers, editors, agents want to know it, but that's what I just want to tell people that. Because I think too often people with mental health problems get a bit of a, you know, oh well, you know, they're the ones that do all the wrong bits. Well, actually, that's not quite true, really.
Picking up on the point you're making, Kate, about you know, sort of mental health can be an issue in all types of areas in society. You know, in a lot of my coaching work, you know, I meet people who've got imposter syndrome, and they're, you know, male and female, and it's more often found in females, but you know, I've had men who are finance directors of huge international companies saying to me, I'm waiting for the day they find me out. You know, I know a head of a law firm who stands up to talk about his business and just cannot form a sentence. And I've had to pick up his slides and do the presentation. And it kind of, you know, these issues are beneath the surface in all of us, in the right or wrong circumstance. You know, so I just think psychology is infinitely fascinating.
Yeah, and actually, Kingsley, because I think just the fact that you are a trained psychologist yourself, that is as good in your pitch letter as whatever your book is about. If you can be like, I'm writing this, and I know so brilliantly how my character is going to be because I'm a psychologist, like, yeah, that's going to get you a long way anyway, I think. Okay, we're coming towards the time when we need to wrap things up, so I just have a couple more questions from our lovely audience. If you guys have more questions, either ask very quick questions or save them for our next panel, because we will be having another one. So just to check, Ruth Stevenson, I know you asked a question about drawing on your own experience versus imagining your characters. I'm hoping that perhaps we kind of covered that a little bit in some of the discussions that we had before. If we didn't, do kind of shout in the chat, and I will ask it again more specifically. I'm going to finish with two questions from Casey Chamberlain. One is an interesting question about when we get sort of beta readers for our work, so people to read our early drafts, do we like to include someone who is of a similar professional background, or do we just rely on our own knowledge of that and just steer clear from fellow professionals entirely? Speaking for myself, I would, if I could possibly help it, not consult one of my colleagues in case they picked up a glaring error that I should have known better, and I feel like a total dork. What about the rest of you? Julia, do you want to go first?
I have a writing group because we all did the Faber course together, and a Faber Academy, and 10 of us got together to form a writing group, and that was 5 years ago. And we're still hanging in there, and we pass work round amongst each other. If we've got a big gaping issue with the plot, we'll say, help, I need to get into the top of the volcano to Sainsbury's, and the others will help brainstorm, and so it's very, very supportive. And one is a psychiatrist, but nobody else is a psychologist or therapist, so I guess I don't pass it to people who know about psychology necessarily.
Actually, that's a good point. My spouse is a psychiatrist by background, so I'll often ask them if I need to know about medication. So yeah. What about Kate? What about you? Do you like beta readers who are also in the field or not?
Not. I think it's important to share your work with people who you can trust, and who will give you decent feedback without absolutely destroying you. And actually those are quite difficult to find. And it's also important to think about when you want feedback as well. That's something that I often talk to people about. If you do it too soon, then you'll never get started. And if you do it too late, then it's too late, because you don't want to change anything. So it's important to choose your time. And I certainly had a group of writing friends, and they were really the writing friends who would, so there were other writers and readers who would read my stuff. More recently, I've been working very closely with my editor, so she's more my other reader. But I will ask people, like, if I need to know stuff about medication, I've got a friend who's a clinical psychologist, so I'll rattle her. What would you give this medication for, or something like that? So I'll go with specific questions to people in particular professions. Yeah.
And what about you, Bev?
Well, I mean, just echoing what Kate and Julia were saying about groups. I mean, I'm not in a writing group now, but I have been over the years in lots of different writing groups, and I've loved them. And I think it's so enriching to be able to read other people's work when you're working on your own. So but I totally agree. It depends on timing, and also that thing of, if you tell what your book's about too early, the life can go out of it, can't it? So I mean, but now at the moment, I mean, I'm pretty dreadful actually. I mean, I don't show it to anybody. I don't, and then it kind of goes to my agent and then my editor, and then way down the pile is my partner. So he's probably the last person. But I feel I kind of feel that sense of really wanting to work it out in my head first, whether it's kind of, you know, obviously the first draft is always, however many drafts, always really rubbish, but that kind of sense of, whereas I think too early for me and someone's going, oh, is that going to happen? It's like, no, of course that's not going to happen. So is she going to do this? So I feel quite private about it when I'm in the midst of it. And then I've got a couple of trusted people that I showed my first one to before I sent it to try and get an agent, and they were kind of, they made a few suggestions, but I'm a little bit kind of you know, sort of ferret away, and then I kind of emerge from something. But I think it's whatever works for you, really, isn't it?
You have to find your own process. Yeah.
Great. And our final question, which is quite a fun one, involves a small amount of maths, but I thought it'd be quite interesting. So again, Casey Chamberlain is asking us basically, how do our years of psychology or therapy experience professionally match up with or compare to our years of writing, being writers seriously or professionally? So I'm just doing the maths on mine. So I did my psychology undergrad in the year 2000, and basically my career has been from 2000 till now, so that is what, 23 years. And I started writing, I think, in 2010, so that's 12 years. So my psychology career currently outstrips my writing career, by about double. Yeah. What about you, Bev?
Oh gosh, I can't even do the maths. But I mean, I do. I mean, I still work now. Although I don't work as a clinical psychologist, I still consider that I work as a psychologist. But I probably I started writing kind of seriously. Probably 25 years ago. But you know, that doesn't. But in terms of my kind of route to publication, there are many odd books that will never see the light of day, you know. So and there's no doubt that I feel like I've got better at, I mean, it would be sad not to, wouldn't it, after all the drafts that are hidden away, but I definitely feel I've got better at narrative the more books.
That's good. That's reassuring.
Hooray, you know. I mean, otherwise that would be really sad, but it's sitting going, yes, still putting them at the bottom of the wardrobe. But I think it's probably about even then for me, but I think it's difficult to say, because I'm not sure how I would mark my writing when I started or when I published is quite recent for me. I mean, you know, in the last sort of 5 years. So
yeah. And Kate, what about you? What's your maths?
Oh, easy peasy. I've been writing since I was 19 and I'm 58 now. So other people can do that kind of maths. And I wrote in those, you know, in that time, I wrote a lot of novels that never saw the light of day. Mm-hmm. I also wrote things, non-fiction, that got published, but the novels never saw the light of day. And I really feel that was my apprenticeship.
Yeah.
And I think there's probably two types of writers. And one is the one that their first novel is their best novel ever, and then it's kind of all downhill. And I'm the other type. You know, it's taken me 30 years to reach the point where I'm publishable. I don't know, what was I did 3 years of training, and then maybe a couple of years, so 5 years as a professional counsellor, no more than that.
And what about you, Julia?
Well, I've been a professional psychologist for 36 years. But if I cheat, I've written for longer, because this was my first novel.
Wow.
Beautifully illustrated.
Wow.
Written when I was 11,
Oh.
and there are about 4 in this series. I used to make them for my dolls as well, because I love them so much.
You like the bronze one?
And they were all hand illustrated and coloured in, and it was a bit of a story arc. But then I set it on one side for approximately 50 years. And my first book was published when I was 62, 63. So yes, so there was been a bit of a gap. But yes, so I think if I cheat, writing the longest, but in reality, psychology.
Well, I'll have to tot up the maths and see if psychology or writing is the winner from this panel. Well, on that note, it's pretty much time to wrap things up. First of all, to say thank you to our amazing audience for coming along and participating and joining in, and to our brilliant panelists. So just to remind you, Julia Stone is the author of the book Her Little Secret, and also her next book coming out in just next month and available to pre-order now, which is called The Accident. Bev's debut novel is A Good Enough Mother, and her second novel, The Family Retreat, is out now. And Kate is the author of the DC Donna Morris series, beginning with A Wake of Crows, followed by Drowning Not Waving, and the third in the series, No Justice, will be out in June 2023, but again, available to pre-order now. And again, I'm putting in the chat the link to the place where you can find books from all of the panelists who've been taking part, or who will be taking part in these panels. And speaking of which, our next panel is on the 25th of October, and I'm putting in the chat the Eventbrite link. I think I'm putting in the chat, yes I am, where you can register now, but I also will be advertising this on Twitter over the next few days and weeks, so if you don't quite catch that link just now, then fret not, and I do hope you will all join us again soon. And yes, I will be putting the YouTube video of this up on my own YouTube channel, and I'll share the link for that on my Twitter page. So if you want to check that out and share it with any friends or people that you know who couldn't make it tonight, then do please spread the word. But yeah, just thank you to both, all three of our brilliant panelists, and to you, our lovely audience, for coming.
And thank you, Philippa, very much.
Thank you.